Section 7, we're going to look at the logical failure of the unbiblical worldview. Now, there are many different varieties of the unbiblical worldview, but they all have a common defect. They can't make sense of the existence and properties of laws of logic. In the previous session, we saw how laws of logic stem from the nature of God as revealed in His Word. It makes sense that laws of logic would be abstract, universal, invariant, exceptionless rules of correct reasoning because God is omnipresent, doesn't change with time, and His mind is sovereign over all truth. And we know something about God because He has revealed Himself in His Word. So the Christian can justify the existence and properties of laws of logic. Remember, to justify means he can provide a good reason for believing in something. So in the Christian worldview, that is in our way of thinking, laws of logic make sense and are justified. We have good reasons to believe that we should follow logic in order for our reasoning to be correct. Namely, it stems from the mind of God. But since laws of logic are reflections of thinking of the biblical God, no non-Christian worldview can make sense of them. Non-Christian religions cannot justify the existence and properties of laws of logic, and yet they believe in them anyway, which is irrational. It's not correct reasoning to believe in something for which you do not have a good reason to believe it. That's something we'll cover in greater detail in Chapter 10. For example, consider materialism. Materialism is the belief that all things that exist are material. They're made up of matter. Everything has a location in space. Now, atheists are often materialists. Can the materialists make sense of laws of logic? Well, clearly not, because laws of logic are not material. They are not made up of atoms. Again, you can't pull one out of the refrigerator or stub your toe on a law of logic. They're not material. They don't have a specific location in space. So if materialism were true, then laws of logic could not exist, right? Because they're not material. If only material things exist, you can't have immaterial laws. So materialism is inherently illogical, for if it is true, then logic can't exist. Consider Hinduism. Now, the Hindu worldview is monistic, meaning they believe that all is one. The Hindu believes that distinctions, differences, are merely an illusion, and that in reality everything is one. So if we think we see distinctions and differences, then that means our senses are deceived because there are no distinctions in the Hindu worldview. What we think we see is merely an illusion. It's merely Maya. Can the Hindu make sense of laws of logic? Of course not, because laws of logic call for distinctions, something that the Hindu worldview does not allow. Laws of logic distinguish true claims from false claims. That's the point. Remember, you can state the law of the excluded middle as A or not A is always true. You can state the law of non-contradiction as A and not A is always false. So that's a distinction, true and false. They're different. And so the Hindu worldview doesn't allow for that. Laws of logic cannot exist in the worldview because they call for distinctions, which the Hindu worldview does not allow. Therefore, the Hindu worldview is inherently irrational. Now, most people like to think that they're very logical. But because of their sin nature, they don't want to submit to God. They don't want to admit that He's the reason why we can be logical. So when asked to justify the existence and properties of laws of logic, unbelievers will try to come up with a logical answer, and that always fails. Let's consider some examples. Some people might say, I have a good reason to believe in laws of logic. Experience. In my experience, laws of logic have been very useful in guiding my reasoning. They never let me down, and so I have a very good reason to trust in laws of logic, and that they will continue to work in the future. Well, that may sound good on the surface, but the problem with appealing to experience is that your experience is very limited. You see, you haven't experienced walking on the planet Mars. You haven't experienced what it's like in the core of the sun. You haven't experienced the future. And yet we all assume that laws of logic work on Mars and in the core of the sun and will work in the future. But how do you know that? You haven't experienced those things. And so our confidence in laws of logic cannot be based merely on experience because we expect laws of logic to work in unexperienced regions. It should be obvious that we cannot appeal to experience as the basis for why we expect something to work in an unexperienced situation. Apart from the Christian worldview, there'd be no good reason to expect that laws of logic will work in the future, because no one has experienced the future. Just because something is true in the past doesn't mean that it will always be that way. Otherwise, you might say, well, I'm immortal, because after all, I've never died before, therefore I assume I never will. Well, that's silly. Some things are a certain way for a long time, and then they change. You're alive for almost every day of your life until the last one. And it changes. Now, how do you know that laws of logic are not like that? That there's something that stayed the same for a long time and that tomorrow they don't work anymore? You see, apart from Christian worldview, you can't know that. Apart from the Christian worldview, you have no basis for believing that laws of logic will work tomorrow or even 1 second from now. All right, well, some people might say, well, laws of logic are just useful conventions invented by people. Now, convention is something that is arrived at by agreement, like driving on the right side of the road. In the United States, we all agree to drive on the right side of the road, and that is a very useful convention because it prevents collisions. But other countries use different conventions, right? In Australia, the convention is to drive on the left side of the road, and they all agree to that, and so it works pretty well too. Those are equally good conventions. Are laws of logic like that? Are they conventional? If they were, then different countries would have different laws of logic, just like we have different traffic laws. So in the United States, maybe we'd have the law of non-contradiction, which says you can't have any non in the same sense. Whereas in Australia, they might have the opposite. They might say, no, here in Australia, contradictions are acceptable. You can have A and not A, and they're both true. But of course, that wouldn't work, would it? No, laws of logic can't be conventional, because then they wouldn't be universal. Every nation would have its own set of laws of logic, just like they have their own traffic laws. Therefore, laws of logic cannot be a human convention. Furthermore, they don't change with time, right? I mean, if laws of logic were invented by people could change their minds. There was once a time when the speed limit, the national speed limit in the United States was 55 miles per hour. You were never allowed to go faster than that. But that law has been repealed, and so now some states have a larger speed. If laws of logic were like that, then they can change over time. And maybe on Fridays, you're free to contradict yourself. But no, we know laws of logic aren't like that. They are invariant. They don't change with time. And therefore, they cannot be an invention of people. Now, some people might argue that laws of logic are merely a reflection of the way the universe works. But there are many problems with that idea. First of all, laws of logic are not describing the universe. They're not about the universe. They're about correct reasoning. That's different. Also, the universe is very different in different places, isn't it? I mean, there's some places that are very, very cold, or just a few degrees above absolute zero. There's some places that are extremely hot, like in the core of the sun, where it's millions of degrees. Some places are very dense, like a neutron star. Some places are nearly a perfect vacuum. So if laws of logic were describing the universe, we would expect them to be different in different locations. But they're not. We all expect laws of logic to be universal, the same everywhere, and so they obviously can't be describing the universe. Furthermore, the universe changes with time. Stars explode, the universe is apparently expanding, but laws of logic don't change. So they can't be describing a changing universe. That wouldn't make any sense. As a last resort, an unbeliever might say that laws of logic do reflect the thinking of a God, just not the Christian God, right? Not the biblical God. So my question is, can some other God justify laws of logic and their properties? Well, let's first consider a polytheistic worldview, because there are religions that have multiple gods, like the old Greek system, where they have Zeus and Hera and all these different gods. Well, if laws of logic reflected the thinking of multiple gods, then you'd have different sets of laws of logic, because Zeus does not think in exactly the same way as Hera. And in the Greek system, different gods rule in different locations. And so if you're sailing on the ocean, then Poseidon rules, or Neptune. And so his laws would apply. But if you're in Athens, then Athena's laws would apply there. And so laws of logic would be different in different locations and therefore would not be universal. And so that doesn't work. Furthermore, the Greek gods can change minds, and they often do. They're very whimsical. So there would be no reason to expect laws of logic to be invariant. They wouldn't have this timeless property. It's the biblical God who is beyond time. So you see, any polytheistic system is not going to be able to account for laws of logic. It has to be a one God religion. And if you think about it, there are only three major religions that embrace one God. They are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And of course, there are various cults that have branched off of those. Now, Christianity really is simply the fulfillment of Judaism. Modern day Jews, if they were logically consistent, should be Christians. They should recognize that Jesus is the one God. He is the second person of the Trinity. So that's really the same God. But what about Islam? Can Allah, the God of Islam, justify the properties and existence of laws of logic? Well, no. Why? Well, for one thing, Allah contradicts himself. The biblical God doesn't do that. The biblical God, remember, cannot deny himself, and therefore we have a law of non-contradiction. That's rooted in the nature of God. But the Quran, the holy book of Islam, endorses the Bible, or at least parts of it. It endorses the books of Moses as being inspired by God, so that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It endorses the Psalms of David. It endorses the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, and by the way, it tells us that we're to judge things by God's revelation, including those books of the Bible. And yet, the Quran contradicts the Bible. The Quran, for example, denies that Jesus is the Son of God. It denies that Jesus was ever crucified, raised from the dead. And that's essential to the gospel. So it's endorsing the gospel of Jesus while contradicting the gospel of Jesus. So if Allah is like that, if Allah contradicts himself, then he can't be the basis for example, the law of non-contradiction. As a last resort, an unbeliever will simply make up his own God. And the reason for that is a lot of times people will see the logic of the Christian position, but they do not want to submit to God. They don't want to bow the knee to God. They want a God they can control, a God they can make up, who can be whatever they want him to be. So when you say the biblical God can make sense of laws of logic, most people see that, but they'll say, yeah, but my God can't do. And ironically, a lot of atheists will answer that way. That's a little bit surprising because the atheist is supposed to deny the existence of God. And so if an atheist then says, well, yeah, you know what, my God can do that too, then what you want to ask is, do you really believe in a God now? So you're no longer an atheist? Or is that just a hypothetical? And he'll say, well, no. I'm just pointing out that my imaginary friend can justify logic just as well as your imaginary friend can. Well, no, first of all, that's not my claim. I'm not claiming God is imaginary. I'm claiming God is real. An imaginary God can't justify anything because he doesn't exist. That should be obvious. You see, it's not the idea of God that justifies laws of logic. It's the existence of God. Unless God really exists, and is the way the Bible says, there would be no reason to think that laws of logic exist or have the properties that they have. So, if he appeals to imaginary God, that won't work. You might say, hey, my God really exists and is just like your Christian God, so my God can justify logic too. How would you answer that?